Resentment is one of the most corrosive psychological forces in both individuals and society at large. It emerges when people perceive themselves as victims of injustice, whether real or imagined, and it festers in the absence of responsibility and meaningful personal action. When individuals fail to take control of their own lives, when they refuse to bear the weight of their burdens or fail to strive toward competence, they often look outward for someone to blame. And once that blame takes root, it transforms into resentment, a deeply destructive emotion that seeks not to build, but to tear down. In its mildest form, resentment manifests as bitterness, an internal frustration directed toward those who appear more successful, more disciplined, or more capable. Instead of serving as motivation for self-improvement, it turns into justification for stagnation. The resentful individual does not ask, "What can I do to improve my situation?" Instead, they demand, "Why should that person have more than me?" It is a mindset that does not seek to emulate competence, but rather to destroy it, to drag it down to a more equal level, regardless of the consequences. This mentality is dangerous on an individual level, but it is catastrophic when it infects society. Throughout history, resentment has fueled social and political movements that seek not to elevate the downtrodden, but to punish the successful. This is the story of ideological purges, of revolutions gone wrong, of societies that have collapsed under the weight of envy disguised as justice. The logic goes as follows. If some people are doing better than others, it must be because they have oppressed, cheated, or stolen their way to the top. And if that is the case, then the solution must be to tear them down, to take from them what they have earned, to strip them of their position and status, regardless of whether they got there through effort, skill, or merit. Look at the 20th century, the ideological purges of Maoist China, the Soviet Union's war on the so-called bourgeoisie, the scapegoating of successful groups in various societies. What was the common denominator? Resentment, weaponized as political ideology. The idea that the only way to create equality is through destruction, that tearing down the competent will somehow elevate those who are struggling. But this approach never works. It never leads to prosperity, only ruin. Because societies are not made stronger by the eradication of excellence. They are made stronger when individuals are encouraged to strive for it. Resentment is also self-reinforcing. Once it takes hold, it blinds people to any evidence that contradicts their worldview. It prevents them from seeing their own agency, their own potential, their own ability to improve. Instead of working towards something better, they become consumed by the need to see others fail. This is a disastrous way to live, both for the individual and for the collective. The only antidote to resentment is personal responsibility. Instead of blaming others, individuals must look inward, assess their own shortcomings, and take action to improve their situation. If societies encourage self-development rather than scapegoating, they can avoid the self-destructive cycle of resentment and ensure progress rather than decay. Personal resilience is not just a trait. It is a necessity. Life is difficult and suffering is inevitable. At some point you will encounter setbacks, opposition, and even outright hostility. The question is not whether you will face adversity, but rather how you will respond when it arrives. That is what resilience is, the capacity to withstand hardship, to endure when things become overwhelming, and to continue forward despite the pressure to give up. Resilience is developed through voluntary exposure to challenge. It is not something that simply appears when needed. It is something that is cultivated through struggle. You do not become resilient by avoiding difficulty, by shielding yourself from discomfort, or by retreating at the first sign of resistance. You become resilient by confronting challenges head-on, by stepping into discomfort willingly, and by learning that you are far more capable than you once believed. This is a fundamental psychological truth. Exposure to manageable stressors strengthens you over time, while avoidance makes you weaker. One of the primary reasons resilience is so crucial is because the world is not a fair place. You will encounter people who resent you for your successes, who seek to undermine your efforts, and who delight in your failures. If you do not have the inner fortitude to withstand their attacks, you will be crushed under the weight of their opposition. This is why resilience is not optional. It is the armor that protects you from being destroyed by the inevitable forces of adversity. Resilience also plays a critical role in maintaining integrity. Without resilience, you will be tempted to compromise on your principles the moment standing by them becomes inconvenient. It is easy to speak the truth when there is no consequence for doing so, but what about when telling the truth puts you at risk? What about when holding your ground costs you relationships, career opportunities, or even your reputation? If you are not resilient, you will fold under the pressure. You will abandon what you know to be right for the sake of comfort and social approval. But if you are resilient, you will endure. You will stand by your values, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Another key aspect of resilience is the ability to adapt without breaking. Life is unpredictable. Plans will fail, expectations will be shattered, and circumstances will change beyond your control. If you are fragile, these disruptions will paralyze you. You will become bitter, helpless, and lost. But if you are resilient, you will adjust. You will find new strategies, seek alternative paths, and push forward despite the unexpected obstacles in your way. This flexibility, this ability to endure change without losing yourself, is one of the defining characteristics of those who succeed in the long run. Resilience, ultimately, is about refusing to be defeated. It is about standing up after every fall, about facing hardship with courage rather than retreat, and about taking responsibility for your own strength. And in a world that is often chaotic and unforgiving, there is no greater asset than that. When you decide to take responsibility, to strive toward competence, and to speak the truth as clearly as you can manage, you will inevitably encounter opposition. This isn't a mistake, nor is it an unfortunate side effect. It's an unavoidable reality embedded within the structure of human society. People who challenge the status quo, who refuse to conform to the expectations of the complacent, and who aim to improve themselves and the world around them, become targets. The question is not whether you will face resistance. The question is whether you will keep moving forward despite it. Opposition can take many forms. Sometimes it's direct, a criticism, an attack, or an attempt to discredit you. Other times it's subtle. Social exclusion, quiet disapproval, the slow erosion of support from those around you. Regardless of how it manifests, the goal is often the same: to make you doubt yourself, to wear you down, to force you back into a state of inaction where you are no longer a threat to the established order. And why does this happen? Because change, especially meaningful change, is difficult. It is disruptive. It forces people to confront uncomfortable truths, including the inadequacies of their own choices. And many would rather destroy the source of that discomfort than face the painful work of self-improvement. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it allows you to prepare for it rather than be blindsided by it. If you assume that people will automatically support you when you attempt to do something worthwhile, you are setting yourself up for disappointment. Instead, you must anticipate resistance and accept it as proof that you are treading the necessary path. This doesn't mean you should become cynical or assume that everyone is against you. It simply means that you recognize adversity as an inevitable part of growth. So how do you move forward? First, you must cultivate resilience. You have to build yourself into someone who can withstand criticism, who can endure setbacks without collapsing into bitterness or despair. This means taking care of your physical and mental health, surrounding yourself with people who genuinely want the best for you, and ensuring that your foundation, both moral and intellectual, is solid. If your values are unclear, if your convictions are weak, then the first sign of opposition will shake you. But if you have carefully considered your position, if you have sought truth rather than convenience, then opposition, no matter how fierce, will not deter you. Second, you must be careful with your words and your actions. Moving forward in the face of resistance does not mean being reckless. It does not mean responding to hostility with hostility. Instead, it means proceeding with precision. Speak truthfully, but do so in a way that is effective rather than destructive. Choose your battles wisely. Stand firm when it matters, but do not waste energy engaging in pointless conflicts. Finally, you must remember why you started in the first place. There will be moments when the weight of opposition feels overwhelming. You may wonder whether it is worth it to keep going. In those moments, remind yourself that the alternative, stagnation, complacency, and submission to falsehood, is far worse. Moving forward despite opposition is not just about personal success. It is about contributing to something greater than yourself. It is about making the world a little more ordered, a little more just, and a little more truthful. That is a responsibility worth bearing. At the core of human interaction lies a paradox. We admire competence, but we also resent it. We are drawn to those who embody strength, wisdom, and responsibility, yet at the same time, their very existence serves as a painful reminder of our own shortcomings. This duality fuels both admiration and opposition, whether to elevate or to destroy. When an individual rises in any domain, be it intellectual, social, or professional, they do not simply succeed in isolation. Their success implicitly reorganizes the hierarchy they exist within, and in doing so, it forces others to confront their relative position. If someone has worked tirelessly, taken on responsibility, and demonstrated mastery over their field, their achievements highlight a fundamental truth. Competence is possible, but it requires effort. That realization can be deeply unsettling. It suggests that failure or mediocrity is not merely a product of fate, but often the result of insufficient effort, misplaced priorities, or a refusal to take responsibility. Now, there are two ways a person can respond to this realization. The first is to be inspired, to acknowledge the gap between their current self and their potential, and to use the success of others as a model for self-improvement. This response requires humility. It demands an acceptance of one's inadequacies, a willingness to confront them, and a dedication to the hard work necessary to improve. In a healthy society, this is the natural order of things. The competent serve as examples, the aspiring learn from them, and progress is made collectively. But there is a second response, one rooted in resentment rather than admiration. Instead of using the success of another as motivation to grow, some individuals choose to attack, diminish, or undermine. This is a defensive mechanism. It is far easier to destroy than to build, and it is far less painful to attribute another's success to corruption, privilege, or luck than to confront one's own shortcomings. When people find themselves incapable or unwilling to ascend, they may instead attempt to bring down those who have. This dynamic is present in every aspect of life, from the schoolyard to the corporate world to the highest levels of politics and academia. A student who excels in class might be mocked for being a try-hard. A professional who takes on more responsibility might be accused of arrogance or ambition. A thinker who challenges prevailing narratives might be labeled as dangerous or subversive. These responses are not necessarily conscious, but they are deeply rooted in human psychology. The motivation to take someone down, therefore, is not always about justice, fairness, or truth. Often it is about the discomfort of being confronted with personal inadequacy. It is about the ease of tearing down rather than the burden of climbing up. Understanding this is crucial because it allows us to see opposition for what it is. Not always a legitimate critique, but sometimes the inevitable reaction to competence itself. And recognizing this truth is the first step in developing the resilience necessary to withstand it. When you decide to stand for something meaningful, something that challenges the status quo, you will inevitably face resistance. This is an unavoidable reality of life. People often assume that doing the right thing, telling the truth, or taking responsibility will earn them universal praise, but the opposite is often true. When you stand for something, you expose the shortcomings, complacency, and falsehoods that others have become comfortable with, and that makes you a target. Consider history's most influential figures, those who dared to challenge existing structures. Socrates questioned the moral and intellectual foundations of his society, and what happened? He was sentenced to death. Galileo challenged the prevailing views of the universe, and he was persecuted for it. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke against deep-seated racial injustice, and he was assassinated. The pattern is clear. When you attempt to move the world toward a higher order, you will meet resistance from those who benefit from the current structure, or those who fear change. The cost of standing for something manifests in many ways. You may be ridiculed, ostracized, or even attacked. People will question your motives, misrepresent your words, and attempt to discredit you. This isn't because they are necessarily evil or malicious, though some may be, but because the mere act of standing up forces others to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world they inhabit. And many would rather destroy the messenger than accept the message. Even in everyday life, this principle holds. Imagine you work in an environment where mediocrity is tolerated, where people avoid responsibility, and you decide to change that. You push for higher standards, take on extra responsibility, and refuse to engage in dishonest shortcuts. What happens? You would think people would appreciate your efforts. Some might, but many will resent you. Your very presence becomes a challenge to their comfort. They may gossip, undermine you, or actively work against you, not because you've done something wrong, but because you've done something right. The cost is also internal. When you stand for something, you must endure uncertainty, self-doubt, and loneliness. You have to be willing to sacrifice comfort for integrity. You have to accept that not everyone will understand your actions, and some may never forgive you for disrupting their sense of stability. The psychological toll can be immense, especially if you are unprepared for the backlash that comes with standing firm. Yet despite the cost, the alternative is far worse. To avoid standing for something is to live passively, to allow the world to dictate your values rather than defining them yourself. It is to surrender your agency in exchange for temporary comfort, a comfort that comes at the price of your own authenticity. That is not a life worth living. If you want to move forward, to improve yourself and the world around you, you must be willing to bear the cost of standing up. Because while the price is high, the rewards, integrity, growth, and a life of meaning are far greater. Competence and responsibility are deeply intertwined, forming the foundation of a meaningful and well-structured life. When an individual strives for competence, they take on the burden of responsibility. And when they embrace responsibility, they naturally develop competence. This relationship is not only personal, but also societal. Our institutions, businesses, and cultures are built upon the shoulders of those willing to carry the heaviest burdens. Competence is not merely a matter of talent or intelligence. It is a disciplined effort to master a skill, refine an ability, and produce outcomes that are valuable to others. It is not achieved by accident. It requires sustained effort, failure, and iteration over time. The competent individual is someone who has voluntarily stepped forward and declared, "I will take on this challenge, and I will bear the consequences of success or failure." This is no trivial matter. Many people shy away from such responsibility because it is difficult. It is much easier to avoid responsibility, to let others bear the weight of difficult tasks, and to criticize from the sidelines, rather than build something meaningful. But what happens when someone does choose to be competent? They become an asset to their family, their workplace, and their community. They are the ones people turn to in times of crisis. They are the ones who are trusted with leadership, decision-making, and guidance. And yet, paradoxically, the competent also become a target. Because when you rise in competence, you reveal the inadequacies of those who have not chosen to undertake the same journey. People who avoid responsibility, who refuse to engage in the difficult process of competence building, often find themselves resenting those who succeed. This is why competence is not just about skill, but about character. A truly competent person does not merely accumulate knowledge or technical ability. They develop a sense of duty. They understand that their skills must be put to use in service of something greater than themselves. Responsibility is not a burden to them. It is the necessary structure that gives their competence meaning. A competent doctor saves lives, but only if they take responsibility for their patients. A competent leader steers an organization towards success, but only if they take responsibility for the people under their charge. Without responsibility, competence is aimless. It has no direction, no purpose, and ultimately, no value. And so the pursuit of competence is not just a personal endeavor, it is an ethical one. The world suffers when competent people refuse responsibility, when they decide it is easier to stay in the shadows, to avoid conflict, to allow mediocrity to rule. A society that does not value competence and responsibility will decay, and history provides ample examples of what happens when capable individuals fail to step forward. Therefore, the challenge is clear. If you wish to live a meaningful life, if you wish to be someone of value, you must strive toward competence and shoulder the responsibilities that come with it. It is not an easy road, but it is the only one worth taking.